Hi, this is Jacob with Technically Speaking at Source Allies. Today, we're going to talk about making a simple API with Python and Flask. What I have set up already is a very simple test. I am using PyTest, which is a Python library to allow for pretty easy unit testing. I have it set up to, in the background, just run an extra process to help this all move along a little bit more smoothly. It's going to start up our Flask server for us. This will help us in testing our Flask API, but the actual implementation details of how I did it are not really important to this tutorial. The first thing we'll see here is that I have actually installed Flask. So very simple to do. You can do a pip install Flask, and that will download and install everything that you need. I already have it installed, so everything was already satisfied, as we can see here. Flask is a micro framework built on the WorkSoig server, which itself is built on the HTTP server that is inbuilt in Python. Flask provides most of the necessary parts to building a CRUD API, or really any API, and anything that you need in addition to it that you cannot find out of the box has likely had a plugin or a module for Flask created that will help you to implement that feature or to just serve your needs. We will start our API here, and I think we will do a very simple book API. We will be able to create a book, read or retrieve a book, and then delete a book. We will do all of that by test driving in our implementation. To begin, I am simply importing Flask from Flask, and I am constructing a new instance of it and assigning it to the variable app. I am giving it the current name of the module. This is so Flask can resolve any resources it needs based on the actual file that it is run in. So that is all you need to do to instantiate the Flask API. Once this is actually running, we can do pretty much anything we can with a normal API that does not have any routes added to it. So very little, but it is out there. It is running as a server. And we can see when we actually run our tests, I have our tests set up to run already. And if I run these, we can see that when it is done running, that it has instantiated the server, tried to make a request to it, and has asserted that we are getting a 404, but we wanted it to be a 200. We wanted this URL to be okay and ready to be consumed. So I will begin implementing our CRUD API. Flask makes this pretty easy. We can use decorator syntax with our application object, and it exposes several of the methods that the HTTP will use. So for example, get is an HTTP method. It exposes that and allows us to give it a very simple rule. So this will be the endpoint that we want to hit. And then we just give this decorator to a function that I will call index here. And this will be our view function. From this, we need to return a valid view for Flask to generate. So the easiest way to do this is to just return a value. Flask will do a lot of heavy lifting for you to return that value as something valid. So for example, we want to return the HTML doc type or the HTML over here. I'm just going to copy and paste it because I'm lazy. And we can see over here that I am now returning just an HTML document. And for the most part, in fact, I believe this will just pass the test entirely. So if we run those, we can see that the test passed. Flask will automatically add some things for you, one of them being a content type if it can determine what the content type is. Here, most things will default to HTML. That is typically what a API will return, especially for websites, so it's not a bad default assumption. It also will have the charset UTF-8. That again is not a bad assumption, but it would have ruined our assertion had we not added it here. So just a little bit of preemptive futzing that I've done with it. So now we want to make this actually a useful API. So let's think about the first thing we want to do. I want to create a book. So let's write our first function, our first test to assert that I am creating a book correctly. Here we are creating a new test, it will be given the base server URL, and then we just want to hit some API endpoint that will create our book. Let's go ahead and say, well, it makes sense for books to post to that. That's a very typical pattern for determining what API resource we want to, or how we want to structure our API resources, I should say. For that, we will use the post method. Again, a pretty common practice. And then we need to give it a JSON body. So the easiest way to do this is with the requests library. Again, that is something you can pip install, that I have already done so. And you just give it the keyword JSON in either your post or your put. And the fields will say for a book, let's say our author and title. Seems relatively easy. And I chose a relatively famous book, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I hope I spelled Melville correctly. I think I did, but who knows. And then now that we have our response out of it, or we will have our response, we want to do some assertion on it to make sure it works. Typically, when you're creating a new resource or an API resource, you will expect a 201 created status, so we will do that. As well as there's usually no body, so 201s created usually have no body. We will assert that by doing using a truthy statement. So we will say assert not response.content. The content will be coerced into a Boolean value. And for us, we want to do that because it may not be none due to the way HTTP is implemented as a protocol. In many cases, it may be an empty string. In fact, I know here Flask will return an empty string rather than a none. So using this truthy assertion is easier and more reliable, less brittle, really. So we will try that. So this should be a failing test. We have not implemented this. So if we save this and rerun. Perfect. We got a failure. We see that it has a 404 status. That is the default status that Flask will send back if it doesn't understand a route. And we want it to be a 201. So to go about creating this post, we do something very similar to what we did above. We had this app.get with a route, and we want to make sure that our route is books. So let's do an app.post. We are using the post method, and so we want to make sure to use the correct exposed method on the Flask object. So here, our test is saying, hey, I want to return a 201 and I want there to be no content. It's not asserting anything else. So the minimum that we actually have to do to get this to pass is to just return a 201 with no content. And the way we do that is when in Flask, when you're returning from a view function, you can return several different structures from the view function and have that be valid. The easiest one is to just simply return a value. Flask will be able to inspect it to some degree and put a proper content type on it. For example, in this previous one, it understood that this was probably HTML. Not necessarily because of the actual structure in here of the HTML document, but because if you're just returning a straight string, it's probably going to be HTML rather than anything else. You could theoretically say plain text, but it's probably HTML on the web. You can also simply just return a straight dictionary object. If you do that, for example, like this, Flask will understand that that is probably JSON and automatically attempt to parse it as JSON, and it will send back a content type of JSON. There are a few gotchas with that. You cannot simply return, say, a list of anything, really, as this is not JSON decodable in and of itself, at least according to Flask. In order to do that, you will need to actually import something from Flask called JSONify. This is a helper function that if you are not returning a dictionary object, you can use it and it will turn it into JSON. So in our use case here, it would understand that this is meant to be a JSON array and accurately turn it into a JSON array rather than just blowing up. So simply returning a value will get you most of what you want. The other thing that you might want to do is return a different status code. So in our case, we don't want to just return a 200. We want to return a 201. So to do that, you actually return a tuple. You can either implicitly return a tuple or explicitly return a tuple. And the tuple's first item is going to be whatever the value you want to return. In our case, we want to return just an empty string. And then the second item in the tuple will be the status code. So in our case, it will be 201. So this will return a 201 with no content, which should pass our test. So if we rerun that, we can see that both of our tests pass. Perfect. But this isn't really helpful, right? We didn't actually implement anything. We were just having it return 201. So let's actually try and retrieve this book and do something with it. So the next thing we can do is write another test. So I am going to create this book, Herman Melville again, or Moby Dick by Herman Melville again, and then I'm going to retrieve it again based off the location that I provide. So how do we get the location? Well, the response object and we can actually get the location off of that. So I want to make sure that the location looks like something specific. So I want to use, let's say, a very simple UUID. Pretty ubiquitous, pretty standard, very easy to find and usually built in. So here I want it to have a UUID for the /books resource. So I'm going to split the location. This will be a string by /books /. So that should give me a list split by this. And if I just take the last element of this list, we should be able to get, something might be before it, but then at the very end, after the books /, there should be a UUID string. And I want to make sure that that's a valid UUID, so I'll just do a real quick assertion here using a try-catch statement. So what I did here was I'm simply doing a try-catch UUID, this constructor, which I've imported up here from just UUID. This will throw an error if it is not a valid UUID. Otherwise, it will work fine. That will ensure that this test enforces that the UUID should be of a correct value. And then I can retrieve this UUID from our server again by calling get with the base URL /book/ and then the UUID string. And then on here, I want to make sure that it is exactly what we sent in, right? So I will assert that something equals exactly the JSON body from retrieve. And the thing I will assert is this, our JSON up here. So this should create a book called Moby Dick. Assert that it has a location that is a UUID of a certain format. Then it will try and retrieve that location, and then it will assert that the body here matches. Now, I could, and probably to be less brittle should, just use this location on the request.get, so I don't need to actually check that it's a UUID. I don't need to try and split it. Any API consumer should likely not try and muck with the actual location header and simply use it as a relative or full URI. For this in the test, I just want to make sure that it is a UUID for this small exercise. And then I'll just reconstruct it. Again, for this test, I think that's fine. But in real life, you probably don't want to assert this necessarily. So if we run our test again, we can see that none type object has no attribute split. And that's because we did not actually send any location header back. This brings us to our tuple again on create books. If we were able to send the body and the status, it makes sense then that the third item in our tuple would be our headers. So the headers we want to send back are location, and we want it to look like books slash some UUID from UUID. So here I'll just send back a location header with a UUID. That should get us further along in the test. And now we're running into a JSON to code exception. And that's all fine and dandy. That is because, as you can see here, we are not returning something that is JSON valid. So let's just return something that is JSON valid. And that was not it. Okay, so that broke that test, which makes sense. I shouldn't have just done that. So then the thing over here is it's not expecting JSON. Oh, so what's happening is that it's probably getting a 405, which makes sense. But the error message is kind of unuseful for me, or at least confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and assert that this is a 200. That way, when it fails, it will actually give me something. 405, 404, I mean, that makes more sense too. So it failed for a reasonable reason. It just was not telling me. And then I was trying to get a JSON body off of probably just an empty string. So that's why that was happening. So, all right, that's failing for a good reason. We need to actually implement a get. So we've done this once before. But now we're going to actually implement a specific endpoint to get a UUID. The way we do that in Flask is that you can use parameters inside the actual string. You do that by angle brackets, a type. There's a select few number of types that Flask supports. Use a colon and then give it the actual variable name. I'll call it book ID. And then you need to use that variable name, that exact variable name, in the actual parameter of the method that you're giving the decorator to. So I created a get book. I gave it a book ID parameter, and that exactly matches what's in the app, the actual endpoint here. And so now I need to actually return the book itself. I don't really have the book, and the easy way to make the test pass is doing this, but that's not super useful in this use case because I'm not actually storing anything. So let's assume that I have some tests where I need to actually store it. So if we come up here, we can do book equals request.json. Request is another thing that you can, I'll replace JSON. Request is another thing you can import from Flask. This has the request information on it. So we are giving a JSON body over here to our actual request.post. We want to be able to access that, and to do that, we can use request.json. It is a property, it is not a function, so don't get confused by how requests does it. It is a property, and so we can get the book off of it, and then we want to actually generate a book ID, and we want to set this book somewhere. So I'm going to create just a global variable. You would likely have a database for this or some other persistent storage. For here, we'll just assume that we're doing something else and have a variable allocated to us. And for now, we'll make that a simple map. And then we want to make sure that we actually return our book ID. And then down here in the get book, we can just return our books at book ID. So this should pass our test just as well. Oh, we got a 500. I actually don't even need to look. UUID returns a UUID object. We need to stringify it. There we go. All three of our tests pass. And now we can start implementing further stuff. The last one I will do for now, we could easily keep adding on to this, but I want to make sure that I can actually delete the book. So I'm just going to copy this test. I will rename this because it is important in PyTest to make sure your names are not duplicates, because Python will just allow you to override them and you will not actually be running the test you think you are. I'll just call it delete book. So we're going to do the same thing, post a book, get its location. I don't really care about this. In fact, I didn't care about it up there, but that's fine. We don't want to retrieve it yet. We just want to delete it. Again, requests allows you to just do delete off of it, which is very nice. We will give it the base URL. Actually, I'll just copy this. We will give it that whole URL that we got. We'll call it the delete response, and we will assert that it is a 204. That is a very common status code to get on a delete. And then after that, we will try and retrieve it. It should no longer be there, so we should actually assert that it is a 404, and we don't need a JSON body. So this should be a test that creates and then deletes and attempts to retrieve our book. And we got a 405. So that method is not allowed, which makes sense. We're using the same endpoint that we did for the get, but for a delete. So we need to make another one. And as you may have guessed, we can use app.delete. We will use the exact same pattern as the get and make sure to use the same name for the parameter. And here we'll just do something very similar, and we'll just delete the books at the book ID. Oh, we got a 500. So the reason we get a 500 is because we are now trying to retrieve a book that is no longer there because we've deleted it. Python doesn't really like to get a key out of a dictionary if it doesn't exist. So we just very simply need to check if it exists. And if it doesn't, we can just return a 404. Empty body, of course. And another problem that was probably the actual reason it failed the first time is that I'm not returning anything out of our view. So we want to make sure we actually return out of our review. There we go. So now we're deleting our book, returning a 204. That has been a very simple introduction to constructing an API using Flask. There is a lot more to go into, and in the next episode, I will teach you how to actually run this in a production environment. This has been Jacob, speaking technically with Source Allies. Do you have a topic you want to see covered? Comment down below. If you want to learn more about Source Allies, check out our website in either the description or our profile. We'll see you next time.